On the morning of Sunday, the 23rd of August, 1914, Captain Walter Bloem of the 12th Brandenburg Grenadiers walked his company across a Belgian beet field toward a canal he had been told was screened by nothing worse than cavalry. He was 46 years old, a famous novelist in civilian life, a reserve officer marching in his first battle, and he was about to lose almost everyone he was responsible for. The fire, when it came from nowhere. No smoke, no visible line of men, just a low, fast, continuous cracking from somewhere ahead, and grenadiers folding into the beet rows one after another, the way men do when they are hit, not when they take cover. The battalions pressed on, because that was the doctrine, and the cracking rose to meet them each time, and the men who survived it swore afterward they had walked into banks of massed machine guns. That is what Bloem's soldiers believed by the afternoon, and German accounts from all along that canal say the same. They were wrong. What was firing at them, for the most part, was British riflemen, regulars, working the bolts of their Lee-Enfields at a trained speed no Continental Army had thought worth chasing. Even the cavalry screen Bloem had been promised turned out to be an illusion with a name. It was 2 squadrons of the Royal Scots Greys, and behind them stood an infantry division. By nightfall, Bloem had lost all 5 of his company's officers and half his men. His battalion commander found him in the dark and told him, in words Bloem set down afterward, and the official history preserved, "You are my sole and only support. You are the only company commander left in the battalion. The battalion is a mere wreck, my proud, beautiful battalion." The regiment, Bloem wrote, had been shot down, smashed up, only a handful left. And then the sentence that survived the century. "Our first battle," he wrote, "is a heavy, an unheard of heavy defeat. And against the English we laughed at." What remained of the regiment pulled back a quarter of a mile as soon as darkness allowed, and lay in the fields awake. Their colonel told them, in so many words, why no one would sleep. "If the English have the slightest suspicion of our condition and counterattack, they will simply run over us." That was the first shock. The second one arrived more slowly in the dressing stations and the base hospitals, where German surgeons began cutting away uniform cloth and finding wounds they could not make sense of. Small, clean holes where the bullet had gone in. And where it had come out, wounds out of all proportion, torn wide. The kind of damage the medical textbooks associated with ammunition that every civilized government had renounced by treaty 15 years before. Within months, Imperial Germany formally accused Great Britain of a war crime, not in a newspaper, in a signed diplomatic note delivered in Washington, with captured cartridges packed alongside it and 5 photographs of wounded men enclosed as evidence. The accusation was wrong, and the truth underneath it was worse than the accusation. The British bullet did very nearly everything the banned bullets did. It tore exit wounds a surgeon could not explain, and the treaty writers had tried to make impossible. And it was legal. Legal to the letter, legal in every clause, legal in the only place the law knew how to look. Because the law that governed bullets measured the envelope of the bullet. And what killed the men at Mons was never the envelope. It was the physics sealed inside it. The first German answer was not legal at all. The morning after the canal, Bloem's regiment walked through the town of St. Ghislain behind a bombardment he described with a soldier's satisfaction. "Truly, our artillery shot famously this night and this morning, and the town," he wrote, "looked as if it had been visited by a whirlwind." That was one language for what had happened at Mons, and the guns spoke it fluently. The second German answer took longer to draft, and it began with doctors. Through the autumn of 1914, German military surgeons filed reports on wounds from the British front that they insisted no lawful bullet could have made. One of them, examining rifle wounds from the British sector, recorded that the bullets appeared to tumble in the body, that jackets and corps sometimes broke apart with what he called an explosive action, and that he suspected some tips had been snapped off by soldiers before firing, a modification a man could make in a few seconds against the edge of his rifle. Keep that surgeon in mind. Almost everything he wrote down was true, and almost every conclusion drawn from it was wrong. The reports moved up, the press took them, and the word that attached itself to the story was a word every reader in Europe already knew and already hated. Dum-Dum. By December, the campaign had a legal shape and a destination. Germany could not sue Britain anywhere in Europe because the courts of Europe were busy killing each other. So, the case was sent to the only referee left standing, the greatest neutral power on earth, the United States. On the 5th of December, 1914, the German ambassador in Washington, Count Johann von Bernstorff, delivered a note to the American Secretary of State. It survives, the entire file of it, in the records of the State Department. And it is a strange thing to read because it is built like a criminal prosecution. There are exhibits. Exhibit 1, a photograph of cartridges, 5 standing in a charger and 1 apart. Soft-nosed rounds, the note said, had been given up by a wounded soldier of the Connaught Rangers, who found them mixed in with the regular .303 issued to him before the Battle of Mons. Exhibit 2, a captured cartridge belt, attributed to the Duke of Wellington's regiment and traced down to the named London maker and the named ship across the Channel. And then a postscript in the ambassador's own signed hand. The enclosed 5 photographs were forwarded to me by my government. The wounds were all received in battles against English troops. The photographs are still in the file. 5 wounded German soldiers, photographed clinically, front and profile. Arrows inked onto the prints to mark where the bullets left their bodies. A jaw, a shoulder, a forearm carrying a wound the length of the forearm. They are hard to look at, which was the point. Someone in Berlin had decided that this argument should not be made in words. And the caption, typed under the cartridge photograph, told a story with a knife twist in it. These cartridges, it said, were Dum-Dums manufactured in a small arms factory in Birmingham. They had been made for the Sudan campaign in the 1890s, withdrawn after protest, and then, strange to relate, issued again for the Boer War. These, the caption said, are the original Dum-Dums, and the wounded soldier who surrendered them claimed, according to the caption, that when he protested to his own company captain about what he had been given, the captain told him, in words the German exhibit renders as a direct quotation, "The service bullets will not stop those damn squareheads, so plug them with the old pill." Understand what that document is before believing a word of it. It is the prosecution's evidence, assembled by a government at war, and not one line of it can be checked today against a British record, because the war diaries that might answer for those 2 battalions in August 1914 are not in the file. The quotation may be real, may be embroidered, may be invented whole. But notice what the German lawyers were doing with it, because it was clever. They were not only saying Britain shoots dum-dums, they were saying Britain invented them. And that part was true. Dum-Dum is not a description. It is a town, northeast of Calcutta, and in the 1890s it held a British ammunition works. And inside that works, a superintendent named Bertie Clay did something small and consequential to the standard service bullet. He exposed the soft lead at its nose. A bullet built that way deforms when it strikes, mushrooms, dumps its energy into the first thing it meets. British soldiers on the Indian frontier had complained that the new full-jacketed rounds punched through a charging man without stopping him. The Dum-Dum arsenal's answer stopped him. London did not apologize for it. It defended it, on the record, in Parliament, and the exchange is preserved word for word in Hansard, because in March 1898, an Irish member named John Swift McNeill stood up in the House of Commons and asked the question Berlin would be asking 16 years later. Whether, he demanded, the specific quality of the Dum-Dum bullets supplied to British troops consists in crushing and pulverizing the bone so as to defy all surgical skill. In what respect, he wanted to know, was this bullet less calculated than an explosive bullet to inflict incurable injury? The Secretary of State for India rose and gave the answer of a man with a clear conscience. The old full-jacketed bullet, he explained, frequently failed to attain the object with which all missiles are discharged in war, namely that of disabling the enemy with the least possible suffering. The Dum-Dum bullet, he said, fulfills this purpose. Sit with that sentence for a moment. The official defense of the expanding bullet, spoken aloud in the Mother of Parliaments, was that tearing a man open disables him with the least possible suffering. And the minister added, almost as an afterthought, a line that would echo down this entire story. Anyone, he observed, can convert an ordinary service bullet into a dum-dum by simply flattening its head. The line between a lawful bullet and an atrocity, in other words, was a few strokes of a file. Everyone in the chamber understood that. Nobody yet understood where that logic would end. There was one more understanding in the room, so widely shared it barely needed saying, and the ammunition records of the period say it plainly. The expanding rounds were considered acceptable for use against tribesmen on the frontier and not against Europeans. That was the etiquette of the age, written into supply. One bullet for Africa and the Khyber, another for anyone with an embassy. Europe, watching, was appalled, and Europe wrote its disgust into law with remarkable speed. At the Hague Peace Conference the following year, the powers drew up a declaration against exactly this class of ammunition, and its operative sentence is short enough to hold in your head because the entire story turns on its wording. The contracting parties agree to abstain from the use of bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body, such as bullets with a hard envelope which does not entirely cover the core, or is pierced with incisions. Read it again, slowly, the way a lawyer would. Bullets which expand or flatten. An envelope that does not entirely cover the core. Incisions. The men who wrote that sentence were describing the dum-dum they had just watched Britain build. They banned a construction. They named the parts. Britain fought the ban to its face. Its delegate at the conference, General Sir John Ardagh, stood against the Swiss proposal openly, and his argument, preserved in the histories of the conference, was the frontier argument in dress uniform. Do not ban a construction, he urged. Judge bullets by their effects, not their anatomy, because a small, clean, humane bullet that fails to stop a charging tribesman is not mercy, it is suicide. The conference listened politely and voted for the anatomy. Britain declined to sign. The nation that had invented the expanding bullet stood outside the treaty that outlawed the expanding bullet and stayed outside it through the Boer War, through 8 years of diplomatic weather, until the 30th of August, 1907, when Britain quietly adhered at last. The tables recording that date were compiled in Washington, as it happens, by a scholar named James Brown Scott. Hold on to his name. He returns to this story wearing a different hat. So by August 1914, the ledger stood like this. Germany had signed the ban in 1899 and ratified it in 1900. Britain had fought the ban, refused it, and then joined it 7 years late. When the German note landed in Washington that December, it was aimed with real skill at the one great power whose name was already written into the history of the outlawed bullet. It was a good shot. It missed. Because the bullet actually coming out of the British rifles at Mons was not a dum-dum, not a soft point, not anything the men at The Hague had named. It was something the men at The Hague had never imagined. The wounds of 1914 were a collaboration between a bullet and an army, and the army deserves its paragraph first. Britain's was the only major army in Europe with no conscripts in it, a small, long-service professional force, and after its humiliations against Boer marksmen a decade earlier, it had rebuilt its infantry around a single unfashionable skill, aimed rapid fire. The drill the regulars called the Mad Minute demanded 15 aimed rounds into a target 300 yards away inside 60 seconds, and the best men comfortably beat it. Continental doctrine held that only machines could produce that volume of accurate fire, which is exactly why the Germans at Mons kept reporting machine guns where there were none. The official British history, walking through the actions of that first month, keeps reaching for the same dry phrase. British marksmanship, it records, again and again told its usual tale. The cartridge those professionals were firing was old. The .303 dated to 1888, designed around black powder and converted to modern cordite within 3 years, but the case itself, rimmed and bottlenecked, kept the layout of another century. By the early 1900s, every serious army was rearming around a new idea from Germany: the Spitzer, a sharp-pointed bullet that cut the air instead of pushing it, and flatter and faster wins rifle duels. Britain needed its old cartridge to keep up, and there was a second requirement now, one that had not existed when the Dum-Dum was born, because between the frontier wars and the new century, Britain had joined the Hague Declaration it once refused. The ammunition records of the period state the design brief with no apparent sense of irony. The interim round then in service would do, they say, only until a more effective round could be made that was in accordance with the Hague Convention. Read that brief the way an engineer would have to. Build us a bullet that stops a man like the old Dum-Dum did, and build it legal. Those two sentences, laid side by side on a drawing board in the first years of the century, are the actual parents of everything that happened at Mons. In November 1910, the answer was adopted, and the answer was called the Mark VII, a pointed bullet of 174 grains, lighter than the round-nosed slug it replaced, quicker out of the muzzle. And to make it, the designers at Woolwich did something quietly strange. A pointed bullet of the right length came out too heavy if you filled it with lead from tip to base. So, they did not fill it with lead. Under the jacket, in the front third of the bullet, they put a plug of aluminium, and in later wartime production, compressed wood pulp or paper. Light material in the nose, all the lead at the back. The official explanation for that construction exists in the War Office's own textbook of small arms. And it is worth quoting exactly because millions of lives ended around this sentence, and the sentence itself is perfectly bland. In the pointed end of the envelope, in front of the lead, is an aluminium tip. This is required partly to bring the bullet to the correct weight for the required ballistics, and partly to balance the bullet suitably for accurate shooting. Weight, balance, accuracy. That is the whole of the stated reason. Nothing else appears in the record, then or since. And the rest of the specification is written in the same flat voice, the point struck to a radius of about 8 calibers, a groove near the base filled with beeswax to seal the case. There is no drama anywhere in the document. It reads like the paperwork for a doorknob, but follow the physics of what they had built. A bullet with a light nose and a heavy base carries its center of gravity far to the rear, and a projectile like that is, by nature, unstable. It wants to fly backward. In the air it cannot, because the rifling of the barrel spins it into a gyroscope, and the spin holds the point forward all the way to the target, which is why the Mark VII was, exactly as promised, accurate. Then it arrives. Flesh is hundreds of times denser than air. The light nose slows violently. The heavy base, carrying nearly all the momentum, does not agree to slow with it. The tail tries to overtake the tip, the gyroscope loses the argument, and the bullet begins to turn end over end inside the body. Ballistics men call it yaw. A surgeon sees it differently. A bullet a third of an inch wide goes in. Something more than an inch long turns broadside and tears its whole length through whatever lies in its path. And where it leaves the body, it can leave a wound out of any proportion to the neat hole where it entered. Britain knew. Not from the Western Front, from before there was a Western Front. In 1911, in trials recorded in the professional literature, test shots were fired into the carcasses of sheep and horses to observe the new bullet's behavior, and in 63% of the recorded wounds the Mark VII tumbled. 63%. Written down, filed 3 years before Mons. Now set the bullet next to the law, clause by clause, the way the lawyers eventually would. Does it expand? No. Recovered Mark VII bullets come out bent, doubled sometimes, but not mushroomed. Does it flatten easily in the human body? No. Is the envelope pierced with incisions? It is not. Does the envelope entirely cover the core? It does, entirely, all the way round. Every single test the Hague Declaration knew how to apply, the Mark VII passed. The Declaration had banned a construction, and this was a different construction. The law measured the envelope. The killing was done by the arrangement of weight inside it. And about the arrangement of weight inside a bullet, the law of 1899 said not one word. Was it done on purpose? Here is the honest answer, and it is stranger than either accusation or alibi. The official reason for the light nose is the one in the textbook, weight and balance, and no document has ever surfaced showing anyone at Woolwich designing for wounds. The trials of 1911 show Britain discovered what it had built, at the latest, 4 years before the German note, and changed nothing. Nothing needed changing. There was no law against physics. Nobody in this story had to intend anything. The treaty left a space where intention would have gone, and engineering, doing its ordinary honest work on weight and balance and accuracy, walked into that space and stayed there for 100 years. Berlin's surgeons were not lying about the wounds. Berlin's lawyers were simply reaching for the only crime the statute book contained, and it was the wrong crime. The Mark VII replicated the effects of the outlawed bullet without one outlawed part, which left the German government in December 1914 pressing charges in Washington against a weapon the law could not see. Britain answered the public accusation early and briefly. On the 5th of September, 1914, British representatives in neutral capitals were instructed to publish an official denial. And when the matter was raised on the floor of the Commons that month, it was raised by a familiar voice, John Swift MacNeill, the same Irish member who in 1898 had demanded to know whether Britain's own Dum-Dum crushed and pulverized bone beyond all surgical skill, stood up 16 years later in the same chamber to ask whether the government would answer Germany's charge of the very crime he had once laid at its door. The wheel had come fully around, and the government's reply, preserved in Hansard, was almost bored. This has already been done. One corner of the British cupboard was genuinely awkward, and honesty requires opening it. British officers' revolvers had long been fed a heavy .455 round, nicknamed the Man-Stopper, a design that would have failed the Hague test badly, and both sides knew it. On the rifle ammunition, though, the ammunition of Mons and of Bloem's beet field, the British position was simple, consistent, and as it turned out, correct in law. The service bullet was jacketed, entire, compliant. If odd rounds from the Sudan era had surfaced in a pouch somewhere, they were relics and strays, not policy. Germany said policy. Germany brought exhibits, and Germany asked America to judge. Washington took the case seriously, which tells you something about the moment. The Counselor of the State Department, Robert Lansing, forwarded Bernstorff's note and its exhibits to the Joint State and Navy Neutrality Board and asked for a formal opinion. The board answered on the 18th of December, 1914, in a memorandum signed by its members, and its chairman was James Brown Scott, the same scholar whose treaty tables recorded, in print, exactly who had signed the expanding bullet declaration and when. If any man in America knew the membership of that particular club, it was Scott. The board's opinion is a small masterpiece of legal helplessness. It observed first that the German note never actually specified which article of which convention Britain was supposed to have violated. It treated the note's vocabulary, soft-nosed, dum-dum, mushroom, as one general class, the expanding bullet. And then it arrived at the sentence that gives away the whole American position. The United States, the board wrote, was not in a position to contest the right of belligerents to use dum-dum bullets. Read that again. Not because dum-dums were legal in general, but because the United States had never signed the 1899 Declaration at all. The referee Germany had chosen was not a member of the club, whose rules Germany was invoking. If American factories chose to sell such ammunition to warring powers, the board concluded, no law of neutrality stood in the way. Germany had complained too about American riot guns sold north into Canada, and the board shrugged a second time. Buckshot being, the members reasoned, no more reprehensible than the shrapnel and canister every army fired every hour of every day. There was, the opinion allowed, a broad ground of humanitarianism on which an appeal might be made. On the law, nothing. Germany did not let it rest. In February 1915, a second note arrived, and this one moved the accusation across the Atlantic. Cartridges violating the laws of war, it charged, were now being manufactured in the United States itself for the British government, and the file grew a new exhibit. An American patent for a sporting round that the Union Metallic Cartridge Company marketed in its own printed advertising as the mushroom bullet. On the substance, the Germans again had hold of something real. American plants, Remington among them, held British contracts for .303 Mark VII ammunition, the same bullet, made now by neutral hands for belligerent rifles. The prosecution wanted the referee to notice that the referee's own factories were arming the accused. So, the United States government did the one thing no one else in the world could do in 1915. It put the British bullet itself on trial. The War Department obtained the actual cartridges, the physical exhibits from the German note, and handed them to the Chief of Ordnance of the United States Army, whose officers took the Mark VII apart and measured what they found against the text of the law. The finding went back to the Secretary of State over the signature of the Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison, on the 12th of March 1915, and the operative sentence deserves to be heard in full in its own words. I concur in the opinion expressed by the Chief of Ordnance that the evidence available does not show that the bullet of the British Mark VII ammunition is such as to violate Declaration 3 of the Hague Peace Conference of 1899, to which, however, Great Britain was not a party, nor that the construction of this bullet has been calculated to give unnecessary pain. Acquitted. On the evidence, on the construction, on the letter of the law, acquitted. The envelope entirely covered the core. The bullet did not expand and did not flatten. The one mechanism the treaty had banned was the one mechanism this bullet did not use. Whatever came out the far side of a man at Mons, it had come out legally. And one more honesty is owed here, because the file does not flatter anyone in the end. Germany was not the only accuser, and Britain was not the only accused. Through those same months, Allied governments were levelling the same charge at Germany, with the same conviction and the same kind of evidence: captured rounds, altered rounds, terrible wounds. The scholarship that later sifted both piles of accusations reached the same verdict on both. Individual soldiers, on every side, sometimes doctored bullets or carried what they should not have carried. As official policy, on any side, the charge dissolves. The Dum-Dum War of 1914 was fought mostly on paper, and everyone lost it. And embedded in the acquittal, like a fly in amber, sits a mistake, to which, however, Great Britain was not a party. That was false, and had been false for more than 7 years. Britain adhered to the declaration on the 30th of August, 1907, and the date was sitting in the published tables of the Neutrality Board's own chairman, in print, in Washington, that very year. The American referee ruled correctly on the physics and carelessly on the paperwork, cleared the accused of a treaty while misstating whether the treaty even applied, and no one ever corrected the file. It did not matter. By the letter, the bullet was clean either way. But it is worth pausing on what this verdict actually was. The only formal legal examination of the Mark VII anywhere on record contains a factual error about the law it was applying, and stands uncorrected to this day. Nothing changed. That is the ending of the legal story, and the whole point of it. Germany's case died quietly, its notes filed away, its photographs closed into a folder. Britain changed neither its bullet nor a comma of the law. The Hague Declaration was never amended to say anything about the balance of weight inside a jacket, not after Mons, not after the war, not ever. The law had measured the envelope. The envelope was perfect. Case closed, almost closed. Germany had asked, through the diplomatic forms, that its exhibits be returned when the examination was done, and the American paperwork dutifully requested it. The bullets did come back from the War Department. They just never made it any further. On the bottom of Secretary Garrison's letter, below the signature, a clerk's hand has added a note. The bullets, the exhibits themselves, the rounds a wounded German government said were proof of a war crime, were returned with the letter and filed in the department's safe. A later hand adds a date in 1940, still logging them there. A quarter of a century after the verdict, with another world war already burning, the evidence in the case of Germany against the British bullet was still sitting in a safe in Washington, waiting for a hearing nobody was ever going to reopen. Here is the joke history played on everyone in this file. The bullet that survived a war crimes charge had already been condemned to death by Britain before the war began. The army knew the .303 was obsolete. Not the wounds, the case, the old rimmed 1888 case that jammed the feeding of every modern automatic weapon the future was plainly going to run on. Years before 1914, the War Office had developed its replacement, a clean, rimless cartridge called the .276, and a new rifle to fire it, the Pattern 1913, and the plan was simple. The Mark VII was to be retired, the whole ecosystem of the .303 scrapped, the factories retooled. Then the summer of 1914 arrived, and the plan met the arithmetic of a continental war. You do not change your army's caliber in the middle of the largest mobilization in human history. The replacement was cancelled. The old lines ran day and night, and the condemned cartridge went to war instead of the gallows. The replacement rifle went to war too by the strangest door available, rechambered in American factories as the M1917, and carried by more American soldiers than their own celebrated Springfield. The rifle built to retire the .303 fought in another army's hands. The bullet never noticed. It never came back from the reprieve. The bullet the Germans could not outlaw and the British could not replace simply kept serving. It went through the whole of the First World War. It went to the Second. If your father or your grandfather carried a Lee-Enfield ashore in Normandy or down the jungle tracks of Burma, the cartridge in his pouches was the Mark VII. The same design, the same tip-heavy physics that German surgeons had photographed in 1914. Only the filler in the nose changed, and the reason it changed is its own small window into total war. Aluminium had become too precious for bullets. It was needed for aircraft. So the nose plugs of the Second World War were pressed cardboard and plastic, and Australian factories tinted theirs red. Under the jacket of the most ordinary rifle round in the Commonwealth, there was, quite literally, a piece of wartime economy holding the balance point exactly where 1910 had put it. The British sniper's No. 4 rifle at D-Day fired it. And in the summer of 1940, the same caliber fought the Battle of Britain. 8 Browning guns in the wings of every Spitfire and Hurricane, feeding on belts of .303, ball and tracer and armor-piercing and incendiary mixed to order. A whole family of rounds grown from the same 1888 case, defending London from 30,000 feet. Half the Commonwealth carried it, and when the Commonwealth's wars ended, the rifles did not stop. They only changed hands. Indian factories at Ishapur went on producing the system for decades. Canadian Rangers patrolled the Arctic with Lee-Enfields into the era of smartphones, trusting a Victorian action at 50 below where modern rifles froze. And the program to replace them did not even begin until 2015. In India, the system simply never stopped. The factories at Ishapur had been building Lee-Enfield since before the First World War, and when the army finally modernized, the rifles were not scrapped, they were handed down to police forces across the subcontinent, the way a family hands down a coat. And in Uttar Pradesh, a state of 200 million people, police constables walked their beats with .303s until the state formally paraded the rifle out of service on the 26th of January 2020, Republic Day. A cartridge born in 1888, still on duty 132 years later. The paper trail outlived its subjects in the same stubborn way. The German note, the 5 photographs, the board's shrug, Garrison's flawed acquittal, all of it stayed classified in the State Department's files for decades, and the stamp on every page records the exact moment the secrecy ended. Classification cancelled by authority of the Department of State in 1962. By then, Bernstorff was dead, Garrison was dead, the empires that argued the case were gone, and the bullet they had argued about was still in service on 2 continents. Walter Bloem survived Mons. He survived the whole war, went home and wrote the book that preserved that Sunday in the beet fields. The book the British official historians quoted so extensively because no one had described what their own riflemen did better than the enemy who walked into it. The English we laughed at. His proud, beautiful battalion had been broken in an afternoon by ammunition that would spend the next 6 months on trial for it. Germany asked whether the bullet was a crime. For 4 months, in notes and photographs and legal memoranda, the question crossed the Atlantic and came back with its answer. No, acquitted in the only courtroom available by the only referee left, in a ruling with a mistake in it that nobody ever needed to fix. But the question itself was the wrong question, and that is what this whole file teaches. The men who wrote the law at The Hague in 1899 banned the bullet they could see, the soft nose, the cut jacket, the mushroom. They wrote a law about envelopes. And 15 years later, the wounds came back, worse than before, from a bullet whose envelope was perfect, because nobody had written a law about what happens when you put all of a bullet's weight at the back. The law measured the envelope. It could not see the physics. It still could not see them when the file was sealed, and the bullet it failed to see outlived the treaty, the empires, the accusers, the referees, and very nearly the 20th century itself. The 5 photographs are still in the file, in the American archives, arrows still inked at the wounds of 5 German soldiers whose names were never attached. They were the proof in a case that ended in acquittal, which means they proved nothing, which means they are all that is left of the men themselves. It seems worth saying their wounds were real, whatever the lawyers decided the bullet was. Nothing in this account is reconstructed from memory or law. It comes from the State Department's own file on the accusation, number 763.72116, classification cancelled in 1962. The ambassador's postscript and the 5 photographs still inside it. From the War Office's own textbook, from Hansard, from the treaty tables the American verdict got wrong, and from a German captain's memoir about the Sunday his proud battalion met the physics of the Mark VII. The rifle that fired it was in your family, more likely than not, if your family is British, or Canadian, or Australian, or Indian, or from anywhere the Lee-Enfield served its 130 years. If your father or grandfather carried one, at Mons or on D-Day or on an Arctic patrol. Or if you fired the old .303 yourself on a range or a farm and remember that particular kick against your shoulder, put his name or yours and the place in the comments. The lawyers closed this file in 1915 and the archivists sealed it until 1962. The people who actually carried the thing deserve better than a folder in a safe. Tell us who they were.